Before we dive into one of the most extraordinary stories of World War II, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. This matters because what you're about to witness isn't just history. It's a masterclass in courage under fire, creative problem-solving when death is seconds away, and one man's refusal to accept defeat. February 23, 1945. The same day that iconic flag was raised on Mount Suribachi. But 1,000 yards away from that celebrated moment, a 21-year-old Marine from West Virginia was waging his own war, a 4-hour solo assault that would destroy 7 fortified Japanese pillboxes and earn him the Medal of Honor. His weapon? A 70-pound flamethrower that many considered too crude, too dangerous, too improvised for serious combat. His odds? Astronomical. His backup? 4 riflemen against an entire network of reinforced concrete fortifications that had already stopped tanks, artillery, and airstrikes cold. This is the story of how Hershel Williams turned a weapon skeptics doubted into the deadliest bunker-clearing tool in Marine Corps history. Stay tuned, because this gets intense. Black volcanic sand. The acrid smell of sulfur. Machine gun fire tearing through the air in sheets of lead. Tanks sitting motionless, unable to advance past a wall of concrete pillboxes that seemed to shrug off everything America could throw at them. And then, a Marine corporal, barely 5'6", strapping 70 pounds of pressurized gasoline and nitrogen onto his back. Volunteers were asked for. None stepped forward. Except one. What happened next would redefine modern warfare and prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the most sophisticated. It's the one wielded by someone with nothing left to lose. This story matters because it represents one of the most critical moments in the Pacific Theater, and one of the bloodiest proving grounds in Marine Corps history. By February 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima had become a brutal war of attrition. American forces needed the island desperately. It sat directly between the Mariana Islands and mainland Japan, providing Japanese fighters the perfect staging ground to intercept B-29 superfortress bombing runs. Without Iwo Jima, thousands of Allied airmen would continue dying in the skies above Tokyo. With it, damaged bombers would have an emergency landing strip that could save countless lives. But taking Iwo Jima came at a horrific price. Nearly 7,000 Marines would die in just 36 days. Another 20,000 would be wounded. The Japanese garrison commander, Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kurabayashi, had transformed the 8-square-mile volcanic island into a nightmare of interconnected tunnels, hidden artillery, and reinforced concrete pillboxes designed to withstand direct hits from battleship guns. By February 23, American tanks sat immobilized in volcanic sand, unable to break through the defensive line. Artillery had failed. Airstrikes had failed. Infantry assaults were being cut to pieces by interlocking fields of machine gun fire emanating from fortifications that seemed indestructible. The entire American advance had stalled. This is where Hershel Williams enters the story, not as a superhero, but as a desperate volunteer with an untested weapon and a simple question: can I do something? What he did in the next 4 hours would prove that courage, creativity, and absolute commitment could overcome impossible odds. Hershel Williams was never supposed to be a Marine. Born October 2, 1923, on a dairy farm in Quiet Dell, West Virginia, he weighed just 3.5 pounds at birth. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. When he turned 18 and tried to enlist in the Marine Corps after Pearl Harbor, recruiters took one look at his 5'6" frame and turned him away. He was too short. Marine Corps regulations were clear. But Hershel Williams was stubborn. When the Corps lowered its height requirements in May 1943, he immediately enlisted, leaving behind his job driving a taxi and working construction. He wanted to be one of those tall, straight, proud Marines he'd seen in dress blues back home. He trained in San Diego and was initially assigned to a tank battalion, but fate had other plans. The Marine Corps needed specialists for a particularly dangerous assignment: flamethrower and demolition units. These weren't glory positions. They were survival-against-odds assignments where operators had a frighteningly short life expectancy. But Williams volunteered anyway. His training was technical but incomplete. The M2 flamethrower he'd carry consisted of 3 tanks strapped to a backpack frame, 2 large cylinders holding a mix of diesel fuel and aviation gasoline, and a smaller tank containing compressed nitrogen at 1,500 psi, which was regulated down to 300 psi to force the fuel through a hose to the flame gun. Loaded, the entire apparatus weighed between 68 and 72 pounds, more than Williams weighed as a newborn, and nearly half his adult body weight. The weapon could fire for just 7 to 8 seconds total, with an effective range of only 20 to 40 meters. Operators had to get dangerously close to targets, making themselves perfect targets for enemy snipers and machine gunners. "We had to learn that ourselves," Williams later recalled about operational tactics. The Marine Corps gave them the mechanics but not the battlefield strategy. By January 1944, Williams had joined Company C, 1st Battalion, 21st Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division at Guadalcanal. His first real combat came during the Battle of Guam in July and August 1944. He learned quickly that carrying a flamethrower meant you had a target painted on your back. "I strapped a flamethrower on my back and started crawling toward the pillboxes," he remembered. "I can remember bullets ricocheting off my air tanks." But Guam was only preparation for what awaited at Iwo Jima. The invasion of Iwo Jima, codenamed Operation Detachment, began on February 19, 1945. Williams landed with his division on February 21, 2 days after D-Day, when the beaches had already become a slaughterhouse. The volcanic sand was so soft and loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Vehicles couldn't gain traction. Landing craft piled up on the steep beaches while Japanese artillery, hidden in caves and tunnels throughout Mount Suribachi and the northern highlands, rained devastation on the exposed Marines. By the first day's end, nearly 2,000 Marines were dead or wounded. The Japanese defensive strategy, conceived by General Kurabayashi, was revolutionary and terrifying. Instead of charging the beaches, Japanese forces waited in their fortified positions, hidden underground, allowing the Marines to land and then opening fire when the beaches were packed with men and equipment. The island was honeycombed with 18 kilometers of tunnel connecting hundreds of concrete pillboxes and gun emplacements, many with walls up to 2 feet thick. These positions were virtually invulnerable to small arms, tank guns, and even direct naval bombardment. Welcome to hell, a volcanic rock nightmare that would consume 36 days and more than 800 American lives for every square mile captured. By February 23, 1945, the American advance on Iwo Jima had ground to a bloody, desperate halt. The morning started with the Marines securing Mount Suribachi. The iconic flag raising that would become immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph was happening just 1,000 yards from where Williams and his unit were pinned down. But while celebration erupted at Suribachi, the real battle for Iwo Jima's heart was stalling in the central airfield sector. American tanks had maneuvered forward, attempting to open a lane through a dense network of Japanese fortifications. They failed. The volcanic sand offered no traction. Tank tread spun uselessly, digging deeper into the black earth while machine gun fire ricocheted off their armor. Even when tanks found solid ground, their 75mm guns couldn't penetrate the reinforced concrete pillboxes that General Kurabayashi's engineers had constructed. These weren't simple defensive positions. They were masterpieces of military engineering, buried concrete bunkers reinforced with steel rods, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that could cut down advancing infantry from multiple angles simultaneously. Gun slits were carefully designed, narrow enough to protect defenders from incoming fire, wide enough to allow devastating machine gun arcs that covered every approach. Artillery had been pounding these positions for days. Naval bombardment from battleships offshore had done little more than rearrange the volcanic landscape. Airstrikes had driven the Japanese deeper underground, but hadn't destroyed their fortifications. The pillboxes remained operational, their Type 92 heavy machine guns and Type 96 light machine guns delivering murderous fire at any Marines who attempted to advance. Making matters worse, many positions were connected by tunnels. Destroy one pillbox, and Japanese defenders would simply retreat through underground passages to another position and resume firing. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 more appeared. The human cost was staggering. By this point in the battle, Williams' company had already suffered devastating casualties. Of the 279 men who'd hit the beach with him, only a fraction remained combat effective. Flamethrower operators were particularly hard hit. Out of over 300 flamethrower specialists deployed on Iwo Jima, fewer than 20 would survive the entire battle. Flamethrower operators faced a double death sentence. First, the weapon's short range meant they had to get within 20 to 40 meters of enemy positions, well within effective rifle and machine gun range. Second, the 70-pound apparatus on their backs was immediately recognizable, making them priority targets. Japanese soldiers knew that killing the flamethrower operator stopped the most effective anti-bunker weapon the Marines possessed. Even the ignition system was unreliable. The M2 relied on a cartridge-based igniter that could fail in wet conditions or after extended use. The small battery that powered the ignition spark was notoriously finicky. Operators often carried cigarette lighters and burning paper as backup ignition sources, a desperate improvisation that added precious seconds to an already deadly exposure time. And then there was the psychological weight. Unlike shooting a rifle from distance, using a flamethrower meant watching people burn alive. The weapon projected jellied gasoline, napalm, that stuck to everything it touched and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't just kill, it incinerated, consuming oxygen so rapidly that victims sometimes died from asphyxiation before the flames even touched them. Japanese defenders hated flamethrower operators with particular intensity. Captured operators could expect no mercy. Summary execution was common. This wasn't just battlefield brutality, it was strategic. The Japanese knew that if they could instill enough fear, Marines might refuse flamethrower duty altogether. On this particular morning, Williams' company needed someone to take on the pillbox network that had stopped the entire division's advance. The tanks couldn't do it. Artillery couldn't do it. Infantry charges had failed repeatedly, with devastating losses. The company captain looked at his remaining flamethrower operators. Several were dead. Others were wounded. The few remaining were exhausted, their nerves frayed from days of continuous combat in hell's own landscape. He needed a volunteer. The request hung in the air. Seconds passed. No hands went up. Nobody could blame them, it was likely a suicide mission. The pillboxes were positioned on elevated terrain with clear fields of fire. Any approach would be completely exposed. The operator would be carrying 70 pounds of explosive fuel while trying to close distance against entrenched machine guns. The odds of survival were virtually zero. Then Hershel Williams stepped forward. "I can do something," he said. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a death wish. It was the simple recognition that somebody had to try, and if everyone else was dead or too terrified to volunteer, then it fell to him. He would later say he didn't remember much of what happened next. Combat trauma often blanks out the worst moments. But the Marines who witnessed what followed would never forget. Because what Hershel Williams did over the next 4 hours would become legendary. Hershel Williams began preparing his equipment with the methodical calm of someone who knew there was no room for error. The M2 flamethrower system was deceptively simple but required precise operation. The 2 large fuel tanks, each holding approximately 2 gallons of jellied gasoline, sat vertically on either side of his spine. Between them, the smaller compressed nitrogen tank pressurized the entire system. When Williams opened the regulator valve at the bottom of the pack, nitrogen at 300 psi would force fuel through a reinforced rubber hose to the flame gun in his hands. The gun itself looked like an oversized pistol with 2 trigger mechanisms. The rear safety trigger released fuel flow. The front trigger activated the ignition cartridge that would spark the fuel stream into a jet of flame. Each ignition cartridge could only be used once. The M2 carried 10, giving operators 10 separate firing opportunities before the weapon became useless. Williams checked his harness, ensuring the quick-release buckle was functioning. If his fuel tanks were hit, he needed to be able to dump the entire apparatus in seconds. He loaded fresh ignition cartridges. He tested the regulator valve. Then he strapped 70 pounds of death onto his 140-pound frame. 4 riflemen volunteered to provide covering fire. Their job was to suppress enemy positions long enough for Williams to get within effective range and deliver his payload. It was a suicide mission, but they understood what was at stake. Without breaking through this defensive line, the entire American advance would remain stalled, and more Marines would die every hour the pillboxes remained operational. Williams took a breath and moved forward. His first approach was tactical brilliance masked as desperation. Rather than charging directly toward the pillboxes, which would have made him an easy target, Williams used the volcanic terrain to his advantage. Iwo Jima's landscape was pockmarked with shell craters, rocky outcroppings, and small depressions. He crawled from cover to cover, moving in short, calculated bursts while his covering team laid down suppressive fire. The noise was overwhelming. Japanese machine guns chattered in short, disciplined bursts. American rifles cracked in response. Artillery rounds exploded in the distance. Somewhere behind him, Marines were shouting coordinates and calling for ammunition. But Williams focused on the immediate problem, getting within 20 meters of the nearest pillbox without getting killed. He made it to a covered position about 30 meters out. Too far for the flamethrower's effective range, but close enough to observe the target. The pillbox was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, low profile, reinforced concrete, positioned to cover multiple approach angles. Its gun slit was barely visible, just a narrow horizontal opening maybe 8 inches tall. Williams watched the firing pattern. The Japanese gunners were disciplined, firing in controlled bursts rather than continuous streams. They were conserving ammunition and managing their barrel heat, professional soldiers who knew their business. He waited for the moment between bursts, then moved. 15 meters. 10 meters. Japanese bullets kicked up volcanic sand around him, some ricocheting off his compressed air tanks with metallic pings that should have terrified him but somehow didn't. His covering team was firing constantly now, pouring suppressive fire at anything that moved. At 8 meters, point-blank range for a flamethrower, Williams rose to one knee, opened his regulator valve, squeezed the rear trigger to release fuel flow, and pulled the front ignition trigger. The M2 roared to life. A jet of jellied napalm erupted from the flame gun, a tight stream of liquid fire that shot forward with surprising force. Unlike gasoline, which explodes into an expanding fireball, napalm maintains a coherent stream that can punch through openings and adhere to surfaces. Williams aimed directly at the pillbox's gun slit. The napalm stream found its target. Jellied fire poured through the narrow opening, ricocheting off the interior concrete walls and filling the enclosed space with flame and superheated air. The effect was catastrophic. Temperatures inside the pillbox instantly exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen was consumed in seconds. The Japanese defenders had no chance. They died from asphyxiation and incineration almost simultaneously. The machine gun fell silent. 1 pillbox down. 6 to go. Williams' real innovation wasn't in the weapon itself, it was in his tactical approach and his absolute refusal to stay down. What made his assault so devastating was the combination of careful positioning, aggressive movement, and persistence that bordered on superhuman. After each pillbox was neutralized, Williams would return to friendly lines to resupply. This wasn't cowardice, it was tactical necessity. Each M2 flamethrower carried enough fuel for approximately 7 seconds of total firing time. Williams could fire in short bursts, 1 to 2 second blasts, to maximize his effectiveness, but eventually, he'd exhaust his fuel supply. So he'd crawl back to the staging area, sometimes under fire, and tell the demolitions team, "I need another flamethrower." They'd hand him a freshly serviced unit, fully fueled, with new ignition cartridges loaded. Then Williams would strap it on and head back out into the kill zone. 5 times he made this journey. 5 times he returned for resupply while his covering team continued suppressing enemy fire. Between supply runs, he also prepared demolition charges, satchels of explosives that he'd place against pillbox entrances to collapse the structures completely, ensuring no Japanese defenders could reoccupy them through the tunnel network. His approach to each pillbox varied based on terrain and defensive positioning. Sometimes he could use cover to get within range. Other times he had to make terrifyingly exposed advances across open ground while bullets snapped past his head. On one assault, Williams discovered a pillbox's air vent, an opening on the bunker's roof designed to provide ventilation to the defenders inside. Most operators would have tried shooting flame through the narrow front gun slit. Williams had a different idea. He climbed onto the top of the pillbox, an incredibly dangerous maneuver that exposed him to fire from surrounding positions, and jammed his flame gun's nozzle directly into the air vent. Then he held down the trigger and emptied his remaining fuel into the ventilation system. The effect was even more devastating than firing through the gun slit. The napalm poured directly into the bunker's interior, creating a literal oven. There were no survivors. The immediate tactical impact of Williams' assault was profound and measurable. Within hours of Williams neutralizing the pillbox network, the 21st Marines were able to advance across the airfield sector that had been impassable for days. The defensive line that had cost American lives by the dozen every hour was finally broken. Infantry units moved through the corridor Williams had created, pushing deeper into Iwo Jima's interior and forcing the Japanese garrison into increasingly untenable positions. But the numbers tell only part of the story. By March 6, Williams was wounded by shrapnel. A fragment of a Japanese mortar round caught him in the leg, earning him a Purple Heart. The wound wasn't severe enough to evacuate him from the island, and he fought through the remainder of the 5-week battle despite his injury. When Company C was finally rotated off the front line a week after his Medal of Honor action, only 17 men remained from the original 279 who had landed with Williams on February 21. A 94% casualty rate, a number that still stands as one of the highest sustained losses in Marine Corps history. Williams' survival, given his role and repeated exposure, was statistically impossible. Of the more than 300 flamethrower operators deployed by American forces on Iwo Jima, fewer than 20 survived the entire battle. The weapon's effectiveness came with a terrible price. Flamethrower operators had the shortest combat life expectancy of any specialty in the Marine Corps. The psychological impact of Williams' assault was equally significant, though harder to quantify. Japanese defenders had been trained to believe their pillbox fortifications were impenetrable. General Kurabayashi had designed the defensive network specifically to survive American firepower, tanks, artillery, naval bombardment, airstrikes. The pillboxes had withstood everything America could throw at them. Until one Marine with a flamethrower proved otherwise. Word spread quickly through both American and Japanese lines. For the Marines, Williams became a living legend, proof that courage, skill, and persistence could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. For Japanese defenders, the realization that their strongest fortifications could be defeated by a single determined operator with a portable weapon was psychologically devastating. The tactical doctrine Williams demonstrated became standard operating procedure for Marine assault groups. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, which followed immediately after Iwo Jima, the Marines had formalized what became known as corkscrew and blowtorch tactics, combined assault teams featuring fire suppression elements, bar gunners for long-range suppression, Thompson submachine gunners for close security, flamethrower specialists, and demolition teams. First, suppress the position with covering fire. Second, burn out the defenders with flame. Third, destroy the structure with demolition charges to prevent reoccupation. Williams had essentially invented this combined arms approach through trial, error, and desperate improvisation on February 23, 1945. The Marine Corps simply formalized what he'd already proven worked. The recognition came swiftly. Williams' company commander submitted a detailed action report describing the assault. Witness statements were collected from the 4 riflemen who'd provided covering fire, as well as from other Marines who'd observed the action from nearby positions. The reports moved up the chain of command through battalion, regiment, division, and eventually to Marine Corps headquarters. On September 5, 1945, just weeks after Japan's surrender, Williams returned to the United States. On October 5, he stood in the White House while President Harry S. Truman read his Medal of Honor citation. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as demolition sergeant serving with the 21st Marines, 3D Marine Division, in action against enemy Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, February 23, 1945. Quick to volunteer his services when our tanks were maneuvering vainly to open a lane for the infantry through the network of reinforced concrete pillboxes, buried mines, and black volcanic sands, Corporal Williams daringly went forward alone to attempt the reduction of devastating machine gun fire from the unyielding positions. 27 Americans received the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima, 13 of them posthumously. This represented 1/3 of all Medals of Honor awarded to the Marine Corps during the entire Second World War. The intensity of combat on that volcanic rock had been unprecedented. Williams became one of the few to receive the decoration while still living, a recognition that his survival was almost as remarkable as his actions. The broader strategic impact of securing Iwo Jima proved Truman's decision to invade had been justified, despite the horrific casualties. Between March 1945 and the end of the war in August, more than 2,400 B-29 Superfortress bombers made emergency landings on Iwo Jima's airfields. Each bomber carried a crew of 11 men. Without Iwo Jima as an emergency landing strip, those crews, more than 26,000 airmen, would likely have been killed in crashes at sea. The Marine Corps estimated that Williams' actions alone directly saved the lives of dozens of his fellow Marines who would have died in continued assaults on the pillbox network. Indirectly, by helping secure Iwo Jima ahead of schedule, his contribution was part of a larger strategic victory that saved thousands more lives. But for Williams himself, the psychological cost was immense. 4 years after the war, he struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about the men he'd killed, not because they were human, but because of how he'd killed them. The flamethrower was an extraordinarily cruel weapon. Williams knew this. He'd seen what napalm did to human bodies. He'd smelled burning flesh. He'd heard the screams. I had a tremendous amount of difficulty because I couldn't forgive myself for having to take so many lives in such a horrible, horrible way, he later admitted. 4 years, he coped by drinking heavily at his local VFW post in West Virginia, trying to drown memories that wouldn't fade. It wasn't until the 1960s, nearly 2 decades after Iwo Jima, that Williams found relief through religious faith. He experienced what he described as a spiritual renewal that ended his nightmares and allowed him to process his wartime trauma. He became a lay speaker for the Methodist Church and eventually served as the national chaplain of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society for over 30 years. "It's one of those things you put in the recess of your mind," he said in a 2020 interview, reflecting on the 75th anniversary of Iwo Jima. "Much of the action is just a blank. I have no memory." Combat trauma had literally erased portions of that 4-hour assault from his conscious memory. A mercy, perhaps, given what he'd witnessed and done. The weapon that saved lives also extracted a permanent psychological toll on the man who wielded it most effectively. And the Marine Corps eventually agreed that the toll was too high. By the 1970s, the military began phasing out portable flamethrowers, recognizing that the psychological damage to operators, combined with evolving combat ethics and the Geneva Convention's provisions against incendiary weapons, made them increasingly untenable for modern warfare. Hershel Williams lived to age 98, passing away on June 29, 2022, at the VA Medical Center in Huntington, West Virginia, the very facility that now bears his name. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, the final living connection to a generation that defined courage in the face of existential threat. His legacy extends far beyond a single afternoon of extraordinary valor on a volcanic island. The first lesson is about unconventional solutions to impossible problems. Williams didn't have superior technology. He didn't have numerical advantage. He didn't have air support or artillery backup that could solve the pillbox problem. What he had was a weapon that many considered crude, improvised, and too dangerous to use effectively, and he proved that in the right hands, with the right tactics, it could accomplish what tanks and battleships could not. This principle applies far beyond military operations. Throughout history, breakthrough innovations often come from individuals willing to use existing tools in new ways, or from those desperate enough to try approaches that conventional wisdom dismisses. Williams' tactical innovation, the careful positioning, the aggressive resupply strategy, the creative use of air vents, demonstrated that adaptability and persistence often matter more than technological superiority. The second lesson concerns the mathematics of courage. Williams volunteered for a mission with near-zero survival probability. He made 5 trips back for resupply, each time choosing to return to the kill zone when he could have legitimately stayed in the rear. This wasn't mindless bravery, it was calculated courage. He understood the mission's importance, assessed the risks accurately, and decided that the objective was worth his life. This kind of courage can't be manufactured or mandated. It emerges from a combination of unit cohesion, personal values, and situational necessity. Williams didn't fight for abstract concepts like democracy or freedom, at least not consciously in that moment. He fought for the Marines pinned down around him. He fought because someone had to, and he was there. "The medal belongs to all those Marines who didn't come home," Williams said repeatedly throughout his life. He never claimed to be special or heroic. He simply refused to accept that the situation was hopeless. The third lesson addresses the cost of warfare, not just in lives lost, but in psychological trauma that persists decades after the guns fall silent. Williams spent nearly 20 years struggling with PTSD before finding a path to healing. His nightmares, his guilt over using such a terrible weapon, his inability to reconcile the necessary violence with his personal morality, these weren't weaknesses. They were normal human responses to abnormal circumstances. Modern military psychology now recognizes that trauma is a predictable outcome of combat, not a personal failing. Williams' willingness to discuss his struggles later in life helped destigmatize PTSD and encouraged other veterans to seek help rather than suffer in isolation. His religious awakening wasn't the only path to healing, but his openness about his mental health journey gave permission for others to find their own paths. The fourth lesson concerns the ethics of weapons development and use. The flamethrower represented a moral dilemma that the military eventually resolved by phasing out the weapon entirely. It was extraordinarily effective against fortified positions, probably the most effective anti-bunker weapon available to infantry in World War II. But it killed in such a horrific manner that even hardened combat veterans found it psychologically devastating to use. By the 1970s, evolving standards of warfare and recognition of the psychological toll on operators led the U.S. military to discontinue portable flamethrower programs. The 1980 Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons further restricted incendiary weapon use. The decision recognized that some tactical advantages aren't worth the ethical and psychological costs. Williams' story thus represents both the pinnacle of flamethrower effectiveness and the beginning of the end for the weapon's military use. The fifth lesson is about leadership and recognizing contributions. Williams received immediate recognition through the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. But his contributions continued for decades afterward. He worked for the Veterans Administration from 1946 to 1979, helping other veterans navigate the system and access benefits. He served as chaplain for the Medal of Honor Society. He traveled the country speaking to veterans groups, schools, and civic organizations. In 2010, at age 86, Williams founded the Woody Williams Foundation to support Gold Star families, those who'd lost loved ones in military service. The foundation has erected over 100 Gold Star families memorial monuments across America, ensuring that fallen service members and their families are never forgotten. This work represented Williams' understanding that heroism isn't a single moment, it's a lifetime commitment to serving others. In 2016, the Navy named an Expeditionary Sea base ship the USNS Hershel Williams in his honor, an extraordinary recognition for an enlisted Marine. Williams attended the commissioning ceremony in March 2020, telling the gathered sailors, "May all those who serve aboard this ship that bears my name be safe and proud. May she have God's blessings for a long life of service to America, the greatest country on earth." On July 14, 2022, just weeks after his death, Williams remains lay in honor at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, one of the highest tributes the nation can bestow. Only the most distinguished Americans receive this recognition. The ceremony reflected not just his Medal of Honor action, but his 7 decades of continued service to veterans and Gold Star families. The strategic lessons from Iwo Jima itself remain relevant. The battle demonstrated the horrific cost of amphibious assault against prepared defenses. The casualty rates, nearly 7,000 Marines killed, 20,000 wounded, horrified American military planners and influenced subsequent strategic decisions, including the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan rather than launch a ground invasion of the home islands. The estimated casualties for invading Japan ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million American dead, with Japanese casualties potentially reaching into the tens of millions. Iwo Jima proved that Japanese defenders would fight to the death rather than surrender. Of approximately 21,000 Japanese soldiers on the island, only 216 survived to be taken prisoner. The rest died in combat. This casualty ratio influenced every subsequent strategic calculation about ending the Pacific War. Modern military doctrine still studies the Battle of Iwo Jima as a case study in combined arms operations, logistics under fire, and the challenges of assaulting prepared defensive positions. The corkscrew and blowtorch tactics pioneered by Marines like Williams influenced infantry assault doctrine that remains relevant in urban warfare and counterinsurgency operations today. But perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest. One person can make a difference. Williams wasn't a general or a strategic genius. He wasn't a technological innovator who invented new weapons. He was a 21-year-old farm kid from West Virginia who found himself in an impossible situation and refused to accept defeat. He volunteered when others couldn't. He persisted when stopping would have been understandable. He returned for resupply 5 times when staying in the rear would have been justified. His actions created a tactical breakthrough that saved lives and advanced the strategic objective. But more importantly, he demonstrated that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite fear. Heroism isn't superhuman strength, it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. When asked late in life what he wanted people to remember about World War II and his generation, Williams said, "We were ordinary people who did extraordinary things because our country needed us." That's the truth at the heart of his story. There was nothing superhuman about Hershel Williams. He was scared. He had doubts. He struggled with trauma for decades afterward. But when the moment came and someone needed to volunteer, he stepped forward. That choice, repeated 5 times over 4 hours on a volcanic island 8,000 miles from home, changed history. It broke a defensive line. It saved lives. It demonstrated that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the most sophisticated technology. It's the human will refusing to accept defeat. 77 years after that February day on Iwo Jima, the name Woody Williams still represents courage, sacrifice, and the simple recognition that when everybody else is dead or too terrified to try, somebody still has to step forward and say, "I can do something." That's the legacy. That's the lesson. And that's why this story still matters.